Ask people on the ground actually struggling to find food in Sri Lanka this week how they feel about specializing in producing textiles for the global economy. You can't eat t-shirts. It's an economic development trap, and we need to rethink how we produce resources for human sustenance. The risk of inflation is determined by the availability of real resources, real productive capacity, logistics, supply chains, skilled labor, and so on. Once you run out of those real resources, additional spending will cause inflation. That's good news. Productive capacity is producible, is something you can invest in. Investing more in productive capacity not only creates more jobs, but allows you to actually tame the risk of inflation and then rethink how we rebalance international trade in a way that's not destructive for half the planet.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guest this week, economist and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Professor Fadhel Kaboub. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to him about how global food and energy systems have been fostered to benefit the global north at the expense of the global south, and how understanding modern money is vital to untangling the mess. How can economic theory help? Well, you may have heard of the golden rule, which is that whoever has the gold makes the rules. And that could be true in a world of edible gold, but in many places, it's actually whoever's been empowered to make the rules that makes the rules, including rules about whether or not any of the other rules can be bought or sold for gold. And if you, like me, are old-fashioned enough to believe that the empowerment of rule makers should have something to do with democracy, and democracy should have something to do with elections and informed voters, well, then it might be important for us voters to have the salient facts about important institutions, such as those that issue the money we use. So at the heart of MMT is a description of how money comes into being, flows through, and exits what gets called the economy. And understanding these things, perhaps surprisingly, often reveals to us that finding money isn't the hard part when it comes to meaningful change. In countries where the government issues a floating exchange rate, non-convertible currency, that means the currency is not a promise by the government to pay the bearer a fixed quantity of a precious metal or a fixed quantity of another currency. There is only one way for the government to spend, and that's by instructing its fiscal agent, its central bank, to mark up bank accounts using keystrokes. For more detail about this, you can listen to our episode 126, but the point is that for governments like these that spend using keystrokes, the notion of running out of money is inapplicable. And that's a problem, because it means that in a lot of places in the world, there's always the remote danger of a political party winning office with policies that could move a country in a progressive direction, and then that government actually spending to make those policies reality. And so what voters can be made to think about where money comes from and how it works is something that people who are heavily invested in business as usual intensely care about. Because a politician's job is to balance things that people want, like breathable air and peace, with things that lobbyists want, like oil addiction and war. There's an obvious tension between the two, and to resolve that tension, the simplest way forward is to get the people to think along the same lines as the lobbyists for national cohesion. And that means jobs, jobs, jobs for think tanks and half-informed pundits who have been spoon-fed economic theories that haven't been updated since the end of the gold standard. So I'm not saying that a bunch of outdated ideas being kept alive by a small group of people are entirely responsible for climate catastrophe, resource wars, social destruction, famine. Actually, I am saying that. In fact, as economist Joan Robinson said, the purpose of studying economics is to learn how to avoid being deceived by economists. And I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb to trust an economist who says you can't trust economists. So on with the show. In the following conversation, you'll hear us talk about a thing called monetary sovereignty, which more or less is a measure of how much agency a state has over the currency being used by its population. So a country that issues its own unpegged floating exchange rate currency, which has very little or no debt denominated in a foreign currency, could be said to have a high degree of monetary sovereignty. And a country that borrows in a foreign currency or pegs its currency to another currency or just straight up uses another nation's currency, like, say, El Salvador, a country like that could be said to have a lower degree of monetary sovereignty. But for further explanation of the concept, you can listen to our episode 12. You'll also hear Fadhel briefly talk about hyperinflation in Zimbabwe. And for more on that, I've linked to an excellent article by Professor Bill Mitchell. And finally, just a reminder that the Modern Money Network's online MMT conference is underway at the moment and continues over the coming weekends until the end of May. And there's a lot of great events there. So I've linked to where you can register for all of those events in the show notes. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going. Your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are delighted, as always, to be joined once again by economist and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity, Professor Fadhel Kaboub. Thanks for joining us today, Fadhel.
Thank you for having me back on the show. It's a pleasure.
Before we get into recent events, Fadhel, I think a recent tweet from you sets the stage really well. You wrote, Tunisia gained independence from France on March the 20th, 1956, but it was never fully decolonized. Today, like most of the global South, it is heavily indebted to, economically subservient to, and dependent on the global North. Could you flesh that out for us a bit?
Sure. As I said in that tweet, it's really a shame to see not only my country, but so much of the world, the global South, in this global crisis related to the food crisis and external debt crisis. And when you think of it, one of the first things that happened in the 1950s, as soon as most of the African continent became independent, the Europeans met in Rome, I suppose at the time for the Treaty of Rome, late 1950s, and looked around and decided, all of these newly independent countries, they produce all of our food. We need food sovereignty. And that set the stage for CAP, for the Common Agricultural Policy, which was introduced in the early 60s, 61, I think, or 62, which was very clear, designed to create food sovereignty in the European Union. And we've heard the French Minister of Agriculture in the last couple of weeks commenting in the media, telling the public, don't panic, we have food sovereignty. We've worked on this since the 1950s. We're not going to be in trouble. There'll be higher prices, disruptions, logistics, but it's not us that will suffer. It's really the rest of the African continent that has lost its food sovereignty. And this, to put it in a global context, going back to the 1950s, this is also the aftermath of the famine in India, where the world realized we can't just keep having these famines happening left and right. So we developed this concept of food security, which is not the same thing as food sovereignty. Food security means you can buy food, either domestically produced or internationally produced. So somehow buy it either by income you generate through your exports or money you borrow. Somehow you find food. That's food security. Food sovereignty, we're talking about a whole ecosystem of production of your basic nutritional needs domestically, from seeds to planting, to harvesting, to fertilizing, to logistics and distribution, in a system that makes sure that farmers are actually profitable enough to continue to support a food sovereignty system. So what happened when Europe introduced CAP? European farmers were heavily subsidized to prioritize the production of core staples in Europe. And as a result, farmers in the global south couldn't compete with heavily subsidized wheat and corn and barley. And not only in Europe, but Japan was doing the same right around the same time. The US was doing the same, Canada, the Soviet Union, obviously, which includes Ukraine at the time, and Australia. So those are the big, food sovereignty blocks in the world. So what did farmers in the global south do? They couldn't compete on that front because now you can import the cheaper wheat and corn and soybean from these major countries. So you switch to producing cash crops that you can export, tropical fruits, tomatoes, all kinds of things that are really not needed for your food security or food sovereignty, but they happen to allow you to earn enough cash to import the basic staples, the rice and wheat and corn from the major producers. So that system is being at least questioned, if not seriously altered as we speak. Because not only after the 2008 financial crisis, where we've seen a combination of both things, droughts that reduced global production of wheat and other core staples, but also huge speculative moment after 2008 in commodity market that drove up food prices and led to some countries actually imposing export restrictions to keep the core staples for themselves, like Brazil, Argentina. I think even Russia at the time imposed some restrictions on its exports. And now we have COVID, which taught all of us that just-in-time supply chains in general are not a good idea. We need just-in-case supply chains for everything, but especially for food. You can't rely on having your food security in times of major disruptions. And finally, the conflict in the Ukraine has confirmed once and for all that food security is not enough. Food sovereignty is the only way to secure basic quality of life in any country. You can't have any functioning economy without food, without energy. So the foundations of any meaningful concept of economic sovereignty has to start with food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. And it just so happens that it's also more sustainable ecologically and more just and equitable for farmers in the global south to be the backbone of the economy and not be put into this vicious cycle of race to the bottom where they're constantly thrown under the bus.
What we get taught in economics school is that the more you specialize, the more you trade, and that allows for countries to specialize in certain areas, and that makes everybody richer as a whole. Would you agree with that? Or would you say that, are we giving something up in order for countries to become more sovereign? Or countries will become richer as a result of this sovereignty as well?
It's a nice theory, but let's ask people on the ground, farmers right now, or people who are actually struggling to find food in Sri Lanka this week, how they feel about specializing in producing textiles for the global economy. You can't eat T-shirts. Specialization beyond the core foundations is okay to some extent. Even then, you really have to keep track of the balance in terms of the value-added content of what you're producing. If you're specializing in doing assembly line type of work, that's not good either, right? So you have to have a balance across your economy that allows you to build the core foundation, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and allows you to diversify your economy enough so that you're not just stuck in a vicious cycle of being the assembly line for the global north, specializing in just having low-cost labor and lower regulatory standards, environmental standards, fiscal standards, in order to attract all the assembly lines of the world to relocate to your country. That's not healthy either. It's a question of balance, but that free trade theory obviously is not only being questioned, but it's being ridiculed at this point.
In a recent interview with the Byline Times about how the conflict in Ukraine is affecting North Africa in terms of food, you talk about that the common agriculture policy forced farmers in the global south to switch to cash crops, which we just talked about, but that they are also, those cash crops are also very water and energy intensive. It's like a double whammy. It creates dependency on, imported energy.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you dedicate the most fertile land, the most precious scarce water resources to producing tomatoes and strawberries, and you're competing with 100 plus other countries who also export bananas and strawberries and tomatoes, you're setting yourself up for this constant race to the bottom. There was an article I shared a few days ago talking about how Morocco has, finally sealed this major deal to become one of the biggest exporters of tomatoes to the UK. It's supposed to be a great success story. And Morocco, by the way, is heavily dependent on imports from Russia and Ukraine for its core staples. It's a trap. It's an economic development trap. It's interesting that the global north actually recognized that it's a trap from the very beginning. This is not something that came by accident. During the 50s and 60s, when Europe and other major countries were having discussions about their own food sovereignty, they knew exactly what the consequences would be. And it was very clear in all the free trade negotiations, in the GATT agreements, the WTO agreements. The classic phrase was free trade in everything but arms and farms, weapons and food. Those are not negotiable. The laws of the market and international trade theories don't apply to weapons and food. And this is not an argument of the global south. The global north understands exactly why it is important. So it's an entrapment. And it's time for us to recognize that it's vicious, that it's destructive, that it's causing actual harm. And we need to rethink how we produce the basic resources for human sustenance, food and energy at a minimum. And then rethink how we rebalance international trade in a way that's not destructive for half the planet.
Let's talk about the conditions that have been created on the ground in places like Tunisia and Egypt. You talk about this thing called shrinkflation. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty popular concept in corporate America and I guess corporate world, period. You've probably noticed this, over time, your favorite box of cookies or candies or whatever it is that, you remember from your childhood. You remember that over the years, they've redesigned the box and they've redesigned the logo and everything around that. But you will also notice that the quantity in it has diminished over time and the price has gone up slightly. And it usually happens with the redesign of the box and the colors and the logo and everything. And the piece of candy itself may have shrunk, the individual piece. So that's shrinkflation. In the case of Tunisia and in many other parts of the world, the loaf of bread in Tunisia during my childhood, pre the intervention of the IMF during Tunisia's external debt crisis in the mid-1980s, the loaf of bread was 1 kilogram before it's baked. And today it's 450 grams. So as soon as the IMF intervened in the mid-80s with the structural adjustment program, one of the first things they put on the table is to remove food subsidies, bread subsidies. And it was overnight. And so the overnight prices of bread doubled. Riots started in the south of the country and quickly spread all over Tunisia. And I think in a matter of a few days, there was more than 260 people who died in those riots. And it was not going to end anytime soon. It was a huge pushback from the population. So immediately the president intervened and said, we're going to go back to, where we were a few days ago, bring back the subsidies and, figure something out with the IMF. And the IMF got the message basically at the time that you can't do shock therapy of this magnitude. So what happened since then was shrinkflation. So gradually, you shrink the size of the loaf of the bread. It's really not noticeable when it shrinks it goes from 1 kilogram to 955 grams, and the price goes up by a very small, manageable amount once a year. Usually during good economic times, you raise the price, and you do this for 30 years, and eventually people notice, what just happened here? The loaf of bread is so small.
So what we're saying is this is like shock therapy in slow motion, basically.
Exactly.
It happens a lot with chocolate here. I've noticed that.
Yeah. I mean, nobody wants to see prices going up, especially when it's redesigned in a new box. You don't notice immediately, but after 20 years, you realize, when I was a kid, this used to be twice the size. And then they convince you, well, it's just in your head. You're little.
It's very Orwellian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Down the memory hole,
It's really the core principles of austerity applied with more careful attention to the pushback from the population. It works for a while. Even today, there's still talk about, reducing the subsidies even more and targeting the subsidies to only people who need it. But you have to realize that food subsidies in Tunisia or in Egypt or in the global south are not just about food, because you're really subsidizing an entire global economic system. Because the outsourced manufacturing units that moved from France and Italy and Germany to Tunisia, they're coming because there's low-cost labor. And low-cost labor can't happen unless that labor is able to actually, put food on the table. So if the German company is not paying them a decent wage to afford the loaf of bread, well, the government has to provide that loaf of bread at a reasonable price. So we're literally subsidizing the export-oriented, low-cost manufacturing assembly lines. And because we're doing that, Tunisian farmers who are not subsidized, when they produce the local wheat, they can't sell it at a price that matches the government set prices for bread and flour, because their cost of production is higher. So the government is squeezing those costs down and doing two things at the same time: subsidizing export-oriented manufacturing and the FDI that we're attracting from the global north, and forcing Tunisian farmers out of business and saying, well, if you can't provide it at that low cost, which we require for being part of the global economy, then here's what we're going to do. We're going to import wheat from the Ukraine, subsidize it so that our people can afford it domestically, and you go produce strawberries, which you can sell internationally at higher prices. It's a whole ecosystem that needs to be dismantled if we're going to truly focus on the concept of food sovereignty. Ideally, we want a system with no subsidies. We want farmers to produce domestic food, high quality food, and sell it and be able to generate a profit, which they can reinvest in their own business and sell that bread or sell the flour and the bread to Tunisian consumers who earn decent wages and can afford it without having to resort to a subsidy. That's the goal. And instead, we have a subsidy system that's a patchwork of kind of Band-Aid solutions to the problems we've created by focusing on racing to the bottom with the rest of the world, by focusing so much on foreign direct investment, export-oriented growth, and tourism. Tourism is a whole other, not only you're subsidizing the workers, but you're subsidizing the tourists that you're bringing in, because you have to feed them too. Subsidizing them on the food front, on the energy front too.
So you're talking about countries moving towards food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. What are the policies through the MMT lens that can move a country in that direction?
This is actually a problem in many post-colonial countries. It's land ownership and land titles. It's a problem that hasn't been sorted out properly since independence days, because there was land that was owned by colonizers and there was land that was owned communally by regional tribes and clans, and there was land that was acquired by the government or confiscated by the government. So there's so many complicated land rights issues that need to be sorted out. And this has been a very big problem for farmers because it's a multiple claims by different entities, and the government just wasn't able to sort it out. So that's one big obstacle. And you've seen what happened in Zimbabwe when land redistribution was done the wrong way. It led to hyperinflation. So that's not uncommon, actually, in many countries in the global south. And actually, to some extent, even in places like the Ukraine, there was actually a land reform law that was pushed through the parliament before the war. It was really meant to concentrate land ownership in the hands of the large agribusiness producers. Because once you have a title to the land, you qualify for bank loans. And you qualify not only for bank loans domestically, but you qualify for bank loans from Germany or France. So you borrow externally at lower cost, right? Because it's a lower interest rate. So there's a whole series of things, predatory things that can happen to agriculture if land reform is not done the right way and if it's not supplemented by other strategies. Because farmers, in many cases, they don't have access to loans from private banks, domestic or international, to buy the equipment they need, to buy the fertilizers they need, to invest in their own productive capacity, productivity, and so on, because they don't have title to the land. But once you give them title and they have it as private property, all kinds of things can happen. You can have big agribusiness groups coming in and buying all the small farms and concentrating their market power. You can have leasing agreements, which means you keep working the land, but you're technically leasing it to a large group that controls the production process. So you become an employee in that land. There's all kinds of risks associated with that transition if it's not done right.
It's funny you mentioned the issue of the land. So in Peru, we had this big redistribution of land in the 70s. Initially, it was a feudal system. We had landlords and farmers working in it. But the government was quite keen on basically taking all the land away from the landowners, redistributing it, but doing so in a way where you had kind of collective. What they didn't want is to divide the land into two small pieces, because they thought they wanted to keep, efficiency, and they wanted basically farmers to go into more cooperative type arrangements as to running the land. That was met with resistance from some farmers who literally just wanted their land. And in the end, I think they ended up going for that kind of individual kind of land ownership. And what is happening now, or what happened in the decades after, was that the big kind of conglomerates, it was easier for them to buy it in the small batches from individual farmers than it was to buy it. So it's almost like going full circle in a way.
And inheritance laws also make it very complicated when you don't have proper titles for land. After 2 generations, you have 50, 60 different distant cousins owning bits and pieces of the grandfather's land, and none of them are in the business of farming to begin with, so they're absentee owners. It makes it very ineffective way of managing agricultural policy. So these things need to be sorted out. That's like one of the big problems. It's not impossible, but it needs to be done. And it's sometimes just having the political courage to do it, and to do it in a just and equitable way, so that you're not, confiscating without compensation. In Tunisia, there was an attempt in the late 1960s to do this. Tunisia's early days of independence, if you trace it back to one major economist who was a labor union leader, independence leader, who became the top economist in the Tunisian government in the 1960s. His name is Ahmed Ben Saleh. At some point, he was minister of essentially all the ministries that had to do with economic issues, including the central bank. Simultaneously, he had like 6, 7 ministries under his control. And he understood how to decolonize an economy. And he had a plan, and it was literally a plan. I mean, this is the 1960s, right? So planning was a thing. And as soon as he put agriculture on his radar screen, he was convicted of high treason because there was a pushback by the landowners, pushed back by the capitalists. And this was the 1960s, the Cold War. So there was a pushback also from the West. I mean, what are you doing? Going into kind of communal land ownership and land reform that would disturb the system. And he was literally put in prison for high treason. Even though he was the president's best friend at the time, the president eventually helped him, escape and leave the country, and lived in exile in Europe for most of his life and never re-entered politics after that. And it's interesting that he wrote about these things from exile. And he wrote about these things in the 1970s, and he wasn't the only one. There was a large network of economists and UN diplomats from the global South and the global North who understood how to develop the newly independent countries. And he wrote about this in the 70s with a large group of UN diplomats and other economists from the global South and the global North. And he described it as he's describing the dominant development strategy that was being imposed on the global South. He called it the development of underdevelopment. He described the Tunisian economy and most of the economies of the African continent as economies steered from abroad. And he was listening to, all the major European nations and senators in the US and other parts of the world talking about how we need food sovereignty in the global North so that we don't depend on these countries. I have a quote here randomly in front of me because I was looking at it earlier from a U.S. senator in 1985 on the Senate floor. And I quote, he said, "If we do not lower our farm prices to discourage these developing countries from aiming at self-reliance now, our worldwide competitive position will continue to slide. This discouragement should be one of the foremost goals of our agricultural policy." End quote. And this is Senator Rudy Boschowitz in 1985. And I can go through a long list of similar statements from European, Japanese, Australian, Canadian officials who completely understand what needs to be done. It was us against them. Very clear.
So you've been working with a team, including Patricia and Scott Fulweiler, on developing a stress test approach to use for developing policy which takes into account the food and energy sovereignty spectrum. Could you tell us about that?
So, a couple of years ago, even before that, in the MMT community, we've always talked about the importance of monetary sovereignty. And it was really kind of the burden of proof was on us to dig into the details to specify what we really mean about when we say monetary sovereignty, what are its components, what allows a country to increase its degree of monetary sovereignty, and how to measure these things. So we spent a couple of years during the COVID pandemic meeting on Zoom, more or less on a weekly basis with Scott Fulweiler, a number of PhD students at UMKC, and other colleagues from Mexico, and Patricia joined us. And eventually, in the last few months, my thinking has shifted away from kind of our initial laser-focused kind of attention on, we want to develop a metric like an index for monetary sovereignty, to more of a dashboard of risk factors, indicators that will help a country navigate a transition from a low level of monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty, to a higher degree of monetary sovereignty. And the best way to think of it is the following. If you take country X and look back at the last 50 years and make a long list of factors that has forced the country into a crisis, that have forced the country to throw people under the bus, as I say sometimes, that have really tested the country's resilience to external shocks. So those would be, broadly speaking, if the major commodities that you export experience a negative shock in their prices globally, you usually take a hit to your external balance, and that hits your exchange rate, and that usually translates into inflation, food shortages, things like that. Similarly, the major imports that you bring in, if you take a negative hit, meaning if those prices, commodity prices, go up significantly, especially if it's food or energy, then you face a similar consequence. Inflation pass-through effect, your external debt accelerates, your exchange rate weakens, and so on. And those translate into more austerity policies eventually, meaning throwing people under the bus to balance books and pay external debt and all that. So if you make a long list of all of these major shocks, you build a dashboard that you can use for stress testing your economy. And then you realize, well, if these are the areas of vulnerability, then how can I be better prepared as a country to face the next shock without having to impose austerity, without having to sacrifice fiscal policy space and, impose austerity on my people? And for most developing countries, and that's why I always say this is really the foundation, the biggest shock that would force a country to do that are shocks related to food imports and energy imports. Other things matter too, but these are the main factors. So you don't have to, rebuild an entire system of food sovereignty overnight, even though that's what some people wish they can do this year because of food imports and energy imports. But you have to start somewhere. You have to set a target and say in 5 years, in 10 years, we want to increase the volume of wheat production domestically by 10% and hit that target and keep building towards that. And once you think about it, you say, well, what does it take? Well, we need better water catchment systems. So we need to build infrastructure for irrigation. We need to invest more in growing domestic seeds that are better resistant to droughts and pesticides and insects and things like that. So you develop what we call, what do we call it? An agricultural policy.
What's that? Is that like
exactly.
the market? No?
Yeah, exactly. An agricultural policy. And then you do the same thing on the energy front. And then you use your economic diplomacy, because we're not talking about isolation here. You use your economic diplomacy with the global north, with the global south, with east, west, and center, as they say, with whoever is going to be your partner on the technological front, on the research and development front, to meet those targets. And here, economic diplomacy is really important because it allows you to gradually push back against the existing model of economic development, saying, if you really want us to be less dependent on IMF loans, which is the case for Tunisia right now. Tunisia is negotiating an IMF loan potentially because we're out of options. If you're Tunisia and you go to these IMF negotiations and say, please give us $5 billion and we'll do as you please, then we'll be back in the same trap. But if you go into these negotiations, say, okay, we know what you, the IMF, want from us. You want us to be in a more on a better track in 5 to 10 years, so we don't need IMF assistance in the future. We have a vision to get there. If that's what you want, debt sustainability, then here's the best way to get out of the debt trap, which is invest in food sovereignty, invest in energy sovereignty. And this is the best time in the history of the world to go into these negotiations with those arguments, because nobody can say, no, food sovereignty is not a good idea. No, energy sovereignty is not a good idea.
So we often get a question from listeners asking, well, not so much asking as telling us that MMT isn't as relevant in developing countries as it is in countries like the US, like the UK and the rest of Europe, because they are dependent on imports. They are largely sensitive to exchange rate fluctuations. And, what we've been talking about here effectively doesn't deny that there are special conditions that the developing world faces that the global north doesn't. But what would you say that MMT or your understanding of MMT has added to your analysis of the developing world that maybe more mainstream economists or even other heterodox economists have failed to grasp?
Well, if you trace back my early interest in economics, and my specialty was not agriculture or renewable energy or sustainability. I was a money and banking economist. That was my training and that was my interest. But money and banking in the context of developing countries. And when you start looking at the financial crises that developing countries experience, they usually have something to do with the external balance. So I'm not dismissive of the external balance. That's really where I started my work. But then you look at what are these shocks and what are these pressure points that cause those disruptions, and you very quickly discover that you can very quickly trace them to food and energy imports for almost all developing countries and other factors too. So then it becomes a no-brainer that you have to go to the source of the problem as opposed to do this, random interest rate gymnastics and hope for the best, which we've seen failed over and over again. So the question, can developing countries do it versus countries that are heavily dependent? Monetary sovereignty, it's not something that you declare into existence. It's something that you earn, that you acquire through strategic investments. And the ultimate shock to a developing country is an external balance shock that hits your exchange rate and creates an inflation cycle. And this is where MMT's approach to inflation is really useful. MMT says the risk of inflation is determined by a couple of factors. One is the availability of real resources, real productive capacity, logistics, supply chains, skilled labor, and so on. Once you run out of those real resources, additional spending will cause inflation because your economy can't keep up with the additional demand. That's good news because productive capacity is producible. Productivity is something you can invest in. Skills is something you can invest in. There's biophysical limits in terms of the planet, but it's not the shortage of technology or skills that should stop us. If anything, investing more in productive capacity not only creates more jobs, but allows you to actually tame the risk of inflation that would emanate from the shortage of productive capacity or logistical constraints and things like that. So that part we know how to manage, and you manage it by spending more strategically, not by spending less, not by austerity policies. And the second category of risk of inflation is abuse of market power, where you have key players who can create artificial shortages, cartels, monopolies, who can raise prices simply because they can. And that risk of inflation also can't be eliminated with austerity. It can only be eliminated by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. So it's with more government intervention, not less, that you actually tame the risk of inflation. So that is true in the global north. And it's even more true in the global south because you have to prioritize your investment in strategic productive capacity, prioritize the food sector and the energy sector because they're the biggest drain on your economy and they're your biggest area of vulnerability. And you still have to do the democratizing of your economy too. Go after cartels, go after monopolies. And in many cases, those cartels and monopolies are actually very deeply rooted in the export-oriented trade system. Who benefits the most? It's people who import all the consumer goods and they collect commissions on it. They have no interest in building domestic productive capacity. Who benefits the most from exporting strawberries and tomatoes? It's the export companies because they have all the incentives because they're doing the nation a great favor. They're the ones bringing us dollars and euros to pay the debt. So they get exclusive privileges and advantages, tax advantages and other advantages to keep doing what they're doing. So they have not only market power, but they have huge policy influence. And I'm using the polite term, not to call it corruption too. So all of those issues are there. So the MMT lens allows you to identify what are the real risks that you face, what are the sources of inflation pressure point, the sources of vulnerability, and who's standing in the way of altering the system. I think that's a pretty useful starting point instead of spinning our wheels doing the same thing over and over again and hoping for a better result.
So to summarize what you've said, all the other schools persistently overestimate the role of monetary policy, of interest rates in stabilizing prices, but also they wrongly interpret the limitations of developing nations as a restriction on government spending as assuming that there is no role for government spending, basically, and that it's all over-reliance on private investment and FDI flows.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just in the global south. I mean, it's something that Europeans are experiencing and the Americans now are experiencing. And we're about to possibly, hopefully not, relive in different contexts the experience of the 1970s, the stagflation of the 70s, because we have global inflation pressures happening because of COVID and now with the conflict in the Ukraine. And the knee-jerk reaction of central bankers is to do what they usually do, which is raise interest rates, as if raising interest rates is going to stop the conflict in the Ukraine, as if raising interest rates is going to stop or improve the supply chain disruptions that we've experienced since COVID. It's got nothing to do with it other than raising the cost of doing business domestically, which does not improve your productive capacity, usually deteriorates your productive capacity. Raising the cost of doing business, raising the cost of access to credit usually slows down economic activity, which means creates unemployment. Now, in the case of the Eurozone, for example, if the ECB does this and at the same time you have states who are fiscally constrained with the 3% deficit rule and the 60% debt to GDP rules, then not only you have monetary policy tightening causing a slowdown, but you have the fiscal policy side not able to respond by design. So you have not touched the sources of inflation. So inflation keeps going up, and at the same time, you create an economic slowdown. You create an economic stagnation. That's stagflation. In the US, at least, we have a little bit of flexibility in the sense that even if the Fed does what they said they committed to doing this year, which is raising interest rates at least 7 times this year, Joe Biden this week said, celebrating a big reduction in the deficit.
Has he learned nothing?
No, I don't think they've learned anything on that front. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this. But at least what I meant is that if they're serious about keeping this deficit cuts and reducing the size of the federal government, then we could have stagflation too. But at least in the US, we have the flexibility on the fiscal side to realize that we have to do something about it and change course. But in the Eurozone, again, it's by design. States within the Eurozone don't have that flexibility. These are the lessons that the mainstream carried from the 1970s. And they argue that it's the necessary pain we had to go through to break the back of inflation and come out of that decade strong. But just like in the 1970s, our sources of inflation have nothing to do with what the central bank imagines they have to do. In the 1970s was a political conflict in the Middle East that took oil prices through the roof, essentially. Raising interest rates didn't do anything to it. If anything, it caused the global recession. But what ended the inflation cycle of the 70s was, at least in the US, was finding a substitute for imported oil. And that was natural gas that started the fracking in the United States that we struggle with today. But ultimately, it was signing a peace treaty in the Middle East that ended the political crisis. And so it's a geopolitical crisis in which a particular commodity is used as an economic weapon for a particular purpose. Sounds familiar? This is what we're dealing with today. An actual geopolitical crisis in between Russia and NATO that happens to be centered around the Ukraine, the country in the middle. And out of that geopolitical conflict comes a whole set of economic weapons on both sides to be used. On the NATO Western side, you can say it's the sanctions, it's the dominance of the US payment system that was used to kind of freeze the Russian economy or isolate the Russian economy, followed by a comeback by the Russians using one of their economic weapons to even out the terms of the debate. I mean, the conflict is not about economic dominance. The conflict is a political conflict about the neutrality of the Ukraine. But it's unfortunate that most of the media discussion now is about which economic weapon is going to dominate the other into submission.
What gets lost at times like these is we're supposed to be decarbonizing and greening our economies anyway. But here we are going, please do something to make oil and gas cheaper or we'll freeze to death or our food won't get transported. And, how can we resolve the tension between these two competing needs right now? What should we be pushing for?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, Christian, because as you both know, not only the MMT community, but the Green New Deal community around the world, in Europe in particular, have been really pushing for an aggressive decarbonization, more, investment in energy efficiency, investment in renewable energy, and by the same token, energy independence, right? Energy sovereignty for Europe. And what was the response from the Eurozone? We don't have money for all of this Green New Deal stuff. The market will do it. We'll just encourage them. And at the same time, they go and sign a brand new deal to build Nord Stream 2, to import even more natural gas from Russia. And as soon as the conflict started, all of a sudden, somehow the German parliament decides now we need 100 billion euros for national security. And, where did that money come from? But at the same time, not only we're spending more money on national security and defense, but at the same time scrambling to build capacity to import LNG from the US and Qatar and other parts of the world to substitute for Russian gas. Europe is in the process of building more stranded assets and to become even more dependent on LNG, natural gas, and possibly coal, at least in the short run. So what a wasted opportunity the last 10 years.
As you put it in a recent interview, Fadhel, the fossil fuel industry is using this moment to crush the climate change movement and say, you can't live without us, you need oil and gas. And they're emphasizing, you see, transitioning off fossil fuels is impossible even when you really want to do it. Maybe our response should be, remember the pandemic when we cut fuel consumption dramatically to save the world from the spread of COVID and that hurt your profits? Those systems are still in place for us to do that again, this time to save the world from climate catastrophe. So maybe we shouldn't be threatening the fossil fuel industry with a switch to renewables, although we should be doing that in the fullness of time. But right now we could say we could threaten them with another painful, for them, fossil fuel consumption strike. And do it deliberately this time, have the remote working stuff worked out more effectively, have things worked out so that the mental health impacts from isolation don't cause so much harm. And, because it wouldn't need to be like a full-on COVID lockdown, but just a shift to the most remote working we could achieve in a short time frame. We know we can do this. It's a workable plan because we've done it really recently. But anyway, what do you guys think?
I think it could be, in theory, yes, we could threaten with that. I think that you also have the issue of the many people who rely on the oil and gas industry for their livelihood. Obviously, we should make arrangements to move them into other industries. But if you make that threat, I fear that if you alienate those groups of people, then the whole kind of climate agenda could be at risk.
The transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry is absolutely important. So a strike against the oil and gas industry has consequences for them, but also consequences for us. So that's why these switches can't happen overnight. They need to be introduced gradually, but gradually doesn't mean slowly. Gradually can be on a large scale.
They raise prices on us overnight.
Exactly.
So maybe we could go, well, look, overnight, if you want to just change that price, then we won't do our thing.
Yeah, but you have to have government on your side here.
Sure.
The problem is that government is not on our side.
Or we can threaten to nationalize them. If you threaten to nationalize them, that would be very easy.
Well, yeah. You know what happened to governments that tried to nationalize their oil and gas industry in the past. They get overthrown.
Oh, gosh. Okay. Plan B then.
No, yeah, but recognizing the balance of power is important because right now with high energy prices, in the US, for example, the Biden administration has been begging the oil and gas industry to use the drilling permits that they have to increase production. This is the Biden administration way of saying drill, baby, drill, without saying the phrase. A phrase that was uttered a few years ago in an election cycle by a Republican candidate. The response from the oil and gas industry is, why should we? Prices are high. That's in our favor. People are feeling the pain. So that's a good reminder that they can't live without us. Why would we build more productive capacity just during this moment of crisis and then run the risk of flooding the market with output in a few months or in a couple of years, and then we suffer the consequences of lower prices? So they don't want lower prices. This is the time to increase their profit margin, to apply pressure on the political establishment that's trying to decarbonize, to apply pressure on the public, shift the narrative about the energy transition, and demonstrating that you will have shortages and long fuel lines and higher costs because you tried to hurt us a few years ago. And this is a good time for them to make up for lost revenue from the last couple of years of the pandemic. So they can increase productive capacity, but they will not, because they're private entities who don't have to respond to the needs of the public as we see it. So that's where regulation, having an actual energy policy, so an energy policy of a sovereign nation, should not mean do what the oil and gas industry want you to do. It's having an actual strategy to have energy sovereignty, decarbonize the system, because energy doesn't have to be fossil fuel based, and do it in a way that's just and equitable for workers in the industry to transition, for consumers, and without creating a new network of abusive market power under the green transition. We want to not only get rid of the oil and gas as a source of energy, but mostly we want to get rid of the oil and gas lobbying power, which controls a big chunk of the economy. Those are the real challenges. And yeah, the extreme option of nationalizing oil and gas is always an option on the table for a sovereign nation. People in the beginning of the pandemic, when their market shares crashed, the debate at the time was, well, we need to bail out all of these companies, including oil and gas. Well, some of us said, well, why not just go buy these oil and gas companies now that they're cheap, right? And just take over and restructure and actually drive the energy transition without having to worry about shareholders and lobbying groups and all of that. But there was no interest in the government ideologically to do that. Instead, we gave them a bunch of money and we told them, go forth and multiply.
If only we'd told them to go forth and multiply using different language. Moving on to the finance aspect of the conflict, there's a mix of opinions out there about what Russia's stipulation that certain nations pay for Russian gas with rubles is aimed at achieving. And what are your thoughts on that, Fadhel?
So this is interesting because there's been a lot of speculation about why is Russia doing it? How does it actually work? Is this really going to help? And many people turn to some of us in the MMT space and saying, does this really mean that Russia understands MMT and is really trying to use its monetary sovereignty to some extent? So yes and no, it's not very clear. Here's how I think of it. The sanctions obviously are imposed on the Russian financial system, with the exception of oil and gas, which is what Europe really can't live with, at least immediately. So the first thing that happened was a huge crash in the value of the ruble and the exchange rate. That happened as soon as the conflict started and the sanctions were triggered. So by having these gas contracts be paid in ruble, the European importers have to somehow find rubles to make these payments if they're actually going to comply. We've heard from the Europeans that they don't want to comply, that they have contracts denominated in euros, that they'll continue making payments in euros. But from Russia's perspective, why should we accept payments in euros if we can't use them, if you're imposing these sanctions to freeze our euro and dollar assets? So we want something else. So there's two ways for European importers of natural gas to get a hold of rubles to make these payments if they're going to comply. One is to go to the FX market and buy rubles, except the global FX market doesn't really have enough rubles. You have to go to the Russian FX market, which is what apparently Putin and the Russian government wants, is for these entities to come to the local market to buy rubles, which will drive up the value of the ruble relative to the dollar and the euro. And we've seen that just the announcement of the decision actually triggered that process. For the most part, the value of the ruble is almost fully recovered from that initial financial shock. So that's option one. And apparently that's the option that the Russian government wants. They want the importers to open bank accounts and to have these dual bank accounts in rubles and in euros, and to deposit euros in Russian banks and then use the Russian FX market to trade to get the rubles and settle the payments. So that's one way to do it. And I think that's the way the Russian government is thinking. I wouldn't call that necessarily an MMT way of doing things, but it certainly shows that the Russian government figured out a way to create demand for the ruble in order to counter the exchange rate shock.
In a way, they've imposed a ruble tax on the countries sanctioning them, going, okay, I'm giving you a reason for you to need to get a hold of rubles.
Yeah, you create a demand for your currency. The other way that the Russian government could kind of do this is saying, well, you know what? We don't need euros in the first place, whether they're frozen or not. We want you to come to a Russian bank, open a bank account, and borrow rubles. You don't have to bring anything in. Borrow rubles and use them to pay for your natural gas imports. But now you have debt that you have to pay back in rubles. So we're back to square one. Where do you find rubles to pay your debt? Well, one way to do it is to export something to the Russian economy, and we'll pay you locally in rubles. We don't have euros or dollars to pay for imports because of the sanctions. So you all of a sudden kind of drag all kinds of international producers into your local economy and say, here's our shopping list. We want medical equipment, we want electronics, we want XYZ, which is would be an attempt by Russia to literally nullify the effects of the sanctions and sort of exit the euro and dollar international trade system and impose its monetary sovereignty on its international trade partners. So this is not what Russia is doing, but this is potentially on the table from the Russian side. We're not saying anything about the actual conflict here in this discussion. So, I mean, the lesson for us is not about Russia or the Ukraine per se here. It's about what countries can do to reclaim more of their economic and monetary sovereignty. And Russia would not even be able to do any of this. And I think Russia wouldn't have invaded the Ukraine in the first place had they not had the following factors. Russia not only has food sovereignty domestically, but its food sovereignty stretches way beyond its territory, and we all depend on it. Number two, Russia has energy sovereignty not only domestically, it stretches way beyond its territory. And if the European Union had energy sovereignty, the European Union has food sovereignty, but it had energy sovereignty, this would have been part of the calculations on day one before the invasion, that sanctions will be imposed, will be isolated, and nobody wants to import anything from us. So we're stuck. So that would have changed the calculus before the invasion. But because that was the case, Russia has food and energy sovereignty that stretch way beyond their territory, and now they're manipulating the contract payments, changing them into rubles. It's another way of leveraging food and energy sovereignty over, lands beyond its territory to also stretch its monetary sovereignty and as a result its economic sovereignty in a way that almost nullifies the effects of the sanctions and, unfortunately, allows it to continue to stretch its territorial sovereignty into the Ukraine. So we're not saying that, we should all have food and energy sovereignty so we can invade our neighbors. But we're saying having food and energy sovereignty allows you to have a better chance of leveraging your monetary sovereignty or economic sovereignty to serve the interest of your people, which doesn't include invading your neighbors, but the interest of your people includes not having to drain your resources to provide low-cost labor for the global supply chain and drain your natural resources, destroy your environment, and cause all kinds of illnesses to your population in a global race to the bottom to attract more dollars and euros to pay for an external debt. That's really the lesson for developing countries. Without food and energy sovereignty, Russia wouldn't be in this game at all. It would be just as small, just as isolated as most countries in the global south. And of course, these are the first pillars. You can think of other layers of sovereignty. There's technological sovereignty, which is very important. It's interesting that even the EU today is talking about the importance of EU technological sovereignty with the global shortage of microchips. And that's why Intel is building a giant plant right here in Ohio, down the road from where I'm talking to you today. And apparently there's negotiations to build one in Germany, possibly one in Italy, to repatriate the technological sovereignty of the EU back home, as opposed to in China or in Singapore or other places.
I think the point on, many developing countries that have faced sanctions from the US at some point, I hope they're paying attention. Obviously, it's unfortunate that we come to learn about these capacities in this way during a war, but it does, as you say, it just as much as it allows you to look after the interests of your own people, then it also allows you to curtail abuse by other countries onto your own people. So there are important lessons there.
And it's really, allowing us to rethink the very kind of philosophical foundation of globalization.
That's what I was about to ask you.
Yeah, because, remember back in the old days, they used to say, well, if we're all interconnected and interdependent economically, then even if country A and country B have a conflict, it's in everybody's best interest to intervene and make sure it doesn't happen because we all get hurt. Well, so much for that.
I think you've given me a hint of what your answer might be, but I wanted to ask you, to what extent does this signal the end of globalization?
I think if you take into account 2008, COVID, and the conflict, and so many other mini crises around the world, mostly in the global south, you realize that something is fundamentally broken in the system. And it's not like this is going to be the last of things. Hopefully it's the last. But it's unreasonable to think that other potential conflicts will not emerge, other pandemics will not take place. With the impact of climate change, where we're definitely going to have more disruptions to actual physical production of food, with more floods, with more droughts, with sea level rising. There's going to be more of these disruptions. These have to be part of our normal expectations, that there will be disruptions. And the best way to avoid disruptions, number one, is to actually do our best to fight climate change, to slow down global warming as much as possible by the end of the century. But the other thing is to actually deal with it and build resilience and build more regional, decentralized systems of production. It doesn't mean that every tiny little country will have to produce everything by itself and completely isolate, but have more reasonable regional blocks that focus on complementarity of resources and capabilities and focuses on building a regional collective resilience. So even if you're a small country and you don't really have the potential for food sovereignty, think of the 5 countries around you and how you can complement each other's resources and capabilities to have regional food sovereignty, regional energy sovereignty, and build from there. Those are the building blocks. We can all live, for a few months without the next iPhone, I think. We've learned during the pandemic, or with the old monitor instead of buying the new one. But we all know we can't live without food and without energy, and no economy can function without those. So it's time to reconsider some of the big mistakes that we've made over the decades. And it's not me saying it, it's actual policy action from people you and I probably disagree with quite a bit, who are now convinced that we need a different way of organizing production, moving away from just-in-time supply chains to just-in-case supply chains. It's the European Union talking about technological sovereignty and relocating high-tech industries at home, as opposed to chasing the lowest cost producer around the globe for a global supply chain to maximize profits. So it's happening, and it will probably continue to accelerate.
Now, every time I talk with you, I say this, but I wish we weren't resource constrained in terms of time. But the great news is you are always doing talks and workshops, and I assume the best way to stay current with all of that is to follow you on Twitter for updates. And so we'll link to that in the show notes. But before we go, is there anything else that people should be aware of before we sign off?
Well, thank you again for this opportunity. I mean, it's always a pleasure to engage in these very thought-provoking conversations with you, Patricia and Christian. I would encourage listeners to keep engaging with the MMT community, with this podcast, with the guests, wonderful guests that you have on this show, and keep pushing back against the dominant narrative that's taking us towards the cliff. The best way to do it is to call their bluff and be better informed, empowered, and mobilized with your network, with your community, with your circle of influence to help us shift the narrative about these issues.
Fadhel, it's always a pleasure and it's always enlightening talking to you. Thanks again for joining us today on the MMT podcast.
My pleasure.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.